What if I told you America has already tried a decentralized financial system and it nearly broke the economy? Long before Bitcoin or a digital currency, during the free banking era, banks could print their own money, operate without strong federal control, and rise and fall overnight. Thousands of currencies with constant instability. Picture this: you wake up one morning with money in your pocket, and by the afternoon, the money is worth nothing. Not because of war, not because of disaster, simply because the bank had printed it and it failed, and no one told you. This was not a nightmare. This was Tuesday morning in Antebellum, America. Between 1837 and 1863, the United States operated without a single unified national currency. There was no Federal Reserve, no deposit insurance, no government guarantee that the dollar in your hand would buy anything tomorrow. Instead, there were thousands of banks scattered across 30 states, each printing its own money, each operating under its own rules. Some sound reckless and some were frauds. Welcome to the free banking era, one of the most chaotic, creative, and consequential chapters in American financial history. This is the story of what it's like to live through it. To understand the free banking era, you first have to understand what America was born into. This was a nation exploding westward between 1830 and 1860. The population nearly doubled, from 12 million to over 31 million people. Canals were being dug, railroads laid, cities sprouting from the wilderness. Farmers needed loans to buy land. Merchants needed credit to stock their shelves. Speculators needed capital to build factories, mills, and warehouses. Everyone needed money, and there was never enough to go around. The constitutional framers had left the question of banking largely to the states, and the states, eager to fuel economic growth, began chartering banks, first cautiously, then more aggressively. Then in 1836, President Andrew Jackson, deeply suspicious of centralized financial power, refused to renew the contract of the Second Bank of the United States, the closest thing the country had to a central bank. With no national anchor, the floodgates opened. By early 1840s, free banking laws had swept through state after state. In theory, almost anyone could post sufficient collateral, typically state bonds, could open up their own bank and begin issuing their own paper currency. Michigan passed its free banking law in 1837. New York followed Michigan and did the same thing in 1838, followed with Ohio, Wisconsin, Indiana, and more than a dozen other states followed over the next 2 decades. At the system's peak, there were an estimated 1,500 or more state-chartered banks operating across the country, each printing its own notes. Imagine reaching into your coat pocket, finding 5 different kinds of paper money, each issued by a different bank in a different state, and not knowing with certainty which one would be accepted across the street. This was the daily reality that people had to go through during the antebellum America. By some estimates, as many as 8,000 to 10,000 district banknotes varieties were circulating around the country at that time before the Civil War. Each bill bore the name and design chosen by the issuing bank. It reminds me of something digital of today. And crucially, each bill traded at a discount. The further you were from the bank that issued it, the less value it had. A note issued by a sound New York bank might circulate at a close to face value in New York City. But if you tried to spend it in Cincinnati, a merchant might only accept 90 cents on the dollar or 60 or refuse it entirely. To navigate this chaos, businesses and merchants subscribe to publications called banknote reporters, regularly updating guidelines and listing hundreds of banks and the current discount rates on their notes and whether each bank was considered solvent or already suspect. The most widely used was Thompson's Banknote and Commercial Reporter, published in New York. Merchants, storekeepers, traders carried these guides around like the Bible. A good businessman memorized the rates the way a modern professional would memorize exchange rates. For ordinary working people, farmers, day laborers, domestic servants, these guides were hard to obtain. They simply had to trust and just hope of what the value would be for the notes that they had. Every transaction in this era had small negotiation. When you walked into a general store to buy flour, salted pork, or fabric, and the price you paid depending just on what the goods cost, but on what kind of money you were also carrying. Storekeepers were like currency traders almost. They had to decide every day which banknotes they would accept, at what discount, which ones they would refuse. A bill from a nearby reputable bank might be taken at face value, but a bill from a further distance might be cut 50% or rejected outright. Gold and silver coin was always preferred. A quarter eagle gold coin was worth its metal content wherever you went, but hard money was chronically scarce, hoarded by those who had it and rarely seen in ordinary working class transactions. Barter remained common in rural areas well into the 1850s. A farmer might settle a debt to his miller in corn or hogs rather than paper money. Credit extended by local merchants, recorded in handwritten ledger books, underpinned much of the rural economy. For workers paid in wages, the picture was often grim. Employers, particularly in the manufacturing and canal construction, sometimes paid their workers in company scrip or in notes issued by banks that the employer had a financial interest in. Sometimes banks were questionable. When workers went to spend those wages, they found local merchants discounting them heavily, effectively cutting the real value that they've earned in half sometimes. This practice was controversial and resented by labor organizations during the period. The dark side of free banking had a name that Americans of this era referred to. They called it the wildcat banking. Historians still debate the origins of it, referring to fraudulent or recklessly undercapitalizing banks established to issue as much currency as possible before they collapsed, leaving note holders with nothing. Sometimes these crooked banks would be hidden in remote, inaccessible areas, so far from populated areas that the note holders couldn't get to them or travel to them. And they would try to redeem bills for gold and silver, but couldn't do it. In Michigan, especially, the free banking law of 1837 produced a wave of fraudulent institutions. Some banks reportedly moved their gold reserves by wagon from one bank to another just ahead of the examiners, creating the illusion of solvency. The state's free banking experiment collapsed so quickly that Michigan repealed the law the following year. But ordinary bank failures, not necessarily fraudulent, simply the result of just having bad loans and overextension, were devastatingly common. The Panic of 1837 triggered a wave of bank suspensions across the country. The Panic of 1857 struck again with similar force. In each case, banks halted the redemption of the notes in gold or silver, meaning that paper money ordinary Americans held suddenly couldn't be exchanged for gold or silver. For a working family holding banknotes as a savings, a bank failure could wipe out everything that they had accumulated for over the years with their work. There was no insurance. There was no federal backstop. Money was simply gone. Among the documented casualties of Michigan's wildcat banking era was a community of settlers. Contemporary newspaper accounts and county records from 1838 and 1839 described farmers who had accepted notes from the newly chartered state banks as payment for land sales and crops. These were real transactions. A family was selling 20 acres to a neighbor, or a farmer settling a bill at a village store conducted in good faith with this currency. It appeared to be legitimate. However, when several of the Michigan free banks were suspended in 1838, some months later, the notes that those farmers held became worthless, and farmers who had sold land for $300 in banknotes found themselves holding paper that merchants refused to accept. Historian Robert E. Wright, in his work on antebellum banking, documents that communities across the old Northwest experienced exactly the same pattern: genuine economic harm experienced with ordinary households. A more precisely documented account comes from the records of safety fund banks of New York State, When the Dry Dock Bank of New York failed in 1848, its depositors and note holders faced losses that took several years to recover through the safety fund mechanism. New York's safety fund was imperfect and ultimately overwhelmed by a sheer volume of failures, but it represented one of the early American experiments in the systemic financial protection, a concept that would not be realized until later on. For all its dangers, the free banking era also financed extraordinary growth in the American economy. Banks, even though that they were imperfect, unstable, they channeled capital into infrastructure and industry. The canals of the 1830s, the railroads of the 1840s and 50s, the factories of New England and Ohio Valley. Credit flowed where it had not flowed before, and with it came opportunity. The historian Howard Bodenhorn, analyzing the economic records of this period, argues that the banking expansion, despite the instability, contributed to meaningful growth. For entrepreneurs willing to navigate the currency maze, the era offered real opportunity. A merchant who understood which banks were sound, who subscribed to the banknote reporters, who built relationships with trusted counterparties, could operate efficiently and even prosper. It took a war to end the free banking era. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the federal government faced a financial crisis of staggering proportion. It needed to finance an industrial-scale conflict, and it could not do so with the fragmented, unreliable patchwork of the state bank currencies. The Treasury Secretary, Salmon P. Chase, and his successor pushed through a series of landmark financial reforms. The Legal Tender Act of 1862 authorized the federal government to issue its own paper currency, the famous greenbacks, which we have today, for the first time since the Revolution. Then came the National Banking Act of 1863, followed by a strengthened version of 1864. These laws created a system of nationally chartered banks subject to federal supervision, required to hold U.S. government bonds as a backing for their currency. This final blow to the old system came in 1865 when Congress levied a 10% federal tax on all state banknotes, effectively making them too expensive to issue. Within years, the thousands of circulating bank currencies began to vanish. And for the first time, the United States had something approaching that was a more uniform national currency. The free banking era left a complicated legacy. Its failures, the wildcat banks, the ruined farmers, the families who lost their savings to paper that became worthless overnight, were direct inspiration for a more robust financial regulation that followed. Every major American banking reform of the late 19th to 20th centuries, including the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation created in 1933, can be traced back to this free banking era and the failures and what they've learned through the mistakes. But the era also demonstrated something important, that Americans, even though without a reliable financial system, they found a way to survive. They found ways to trade, to build, to persevere. They created their own tools, the banknote reporters, the merchant credit networks, the barter systems, the local institutions of mutual trust. They lived day by day in a world where money in their pocket was either valuable or worthless in a given day. And they kept moving forward anyhow. Until next time, see you in the next story in history.